This is the story of one of the darkest chapters in criminal history in the Dakota Territory, where 5 brothers shared more than blood. They shared a dream that would lead to one of the most disturbing unsolved cases in American frontier history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a like if you find this investigation compelling, as your support helps preserve these forgotten stories that demand to be told. In the winter of 1865, the Dakota Territory stretched endlessly under a blanket of snow that seemed to swallow sound itself. The Pemberton homestead sat isolated 30 miles northwest of what would later become Bismarck, a solitary wooden structure against the vast wilderness where civilization ended and something far older began. The territory had only recently been established, carved from the massive Dakota Territory in 1861, and settlers like the Pemberton family represented the bleeding edge of American expansion into lands that the native tribes considered sacred and cursed. Thomas Pemberton, a weathered man of 53 with calloused hands and steel-gray eyes, had brought his 5 sons to this remote corner of the frontier, with dreams of establishing a cattle ranch that would span thousands of acres. The eldest son, Marcus, was 28, and possessed his father's determination along with an unsettling intensity that made even hardened frontiersmen uncomfortable. Following him were twins David and Daniel, both 25, who moved with an eerie synchronization that locals found deeply disturbing. The youngest was Samuel at 22 and Benjamin at 19, both of whom had developed a peculiar habit of finishing each other's sentences in ways that suggested something far beyond typical sibling closeness. What made the Pemberton case extraordinary, according to documents preserved in the Territorial Archives of North Dakota Historical Society, was not merely the isolation of their homestead or the strange behavior patterns that neighbors began reporting in the months leading up to the incident. Rather, it was the documented phenomenon that would later be termed by Dr. Helena Morrison of Harvard University's Department of Psychological Studies as synchronized dream manifestation. 5 brothers experiencing identical dreams every single night for 6 consecutive months before their disappearance. The first recorded mention of this phenomenon appears in a letter dated November 15, 1865, written by local postmaster Edmund Fitzgerald to his sister in Minneapolis. The letter, discovered in 1967 during renovation of the old Minneapolis post office, describes how Marcus Pemberton had visited the small settlement repeatedly, desperately seeking anyone who might explain why he and his brothers were living the same nightmare every time we close our eyes. Fitzgerald noted that Marcus appeared increasingly haggard with each visit, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that seemed to diminish weekly, his eyes bearing the hollow look of a man who had seen something that fundamentally challenged his understanding of reality. According to the detailed journal entries kept by the settlement's only physician, Dr. Cornelius Blackwood, the dreams began simply enough. Each brother reported dreaming of walking through their familiar homestead, but finding additional rooms that did not exist in their waking hours. These rooms, described with remarkable consistency across all 5 testimonies, contained furniture that appeared to be carved from a single piece of impossibly dark wood, walls that seemed to absorb rather than reflect lamplight, and windows that looked out onto landscapes that definitely did not match the Dakota terrain they knew intimately. Dr. Blackwood's journal, preserved in the medical archives of the Minnesota Historical Society, documents his growing fascination and concern as the dreams evolved over the subsequent months. By December 1865, the brothers reported that the mysterious rooms had begun to contain occupants, shadowy figures that stood motionless in corners, their faces obscured, but their presence unmistakably malevolent. What disturbed Dr. Blackwood most profoundly was not merely the shared nature of these visions, but the physical evidence that began manifesting in their waking hours. The brothers started displaying identical marks on their bodies, thin scratches that appeared overnight, in patterns that defied natural explanation. Samuel Pemberton showed Dr. Blackwood a series of parallel lines across his forearms that formed what appeared to be symbols resembling no known language or tribal markings from the region. When Benjamin rolled up his sleeves during the same examination, he revealed identical markings in precisely the same locations, down to the millimeter. David and Daniel, examined 2 days later, displayed the same phenomenon, while Marcus refused examination entirely, claiming that acknowledging the marks would give them more power over us. The local territorial newspaper, the Dakota Frontier Herald, published 3 articles about the Pemberton family between December 1865 and February 1866. The first article, dated December 22, 1865, treated the shared dreams as an amusing frontier curiosity, suggesting that isolation and harsh winter conditions might explain what the writer dismissed as collective imagination run wild. However, the tone shifted dramatically in the second article, published January 18, 1866, following reports from neighboring homesteaders about strange lights emanating from the Pemberton property during the deepest part of winter nights. Jeremiah Hutchinson, whose homestead lay 7 miles southeast of the Pemberton ranch, provided a sworn statement to the territorial sheriff describing lights that danced like living things around the Pemberton house between midnight and dawn. These lights, according to Hutchinson's testimony, preserved in the Burleigh County Records Office, did not behave like any natural phenomenon he recognized from 30 years of frontier life. Rather than flickering randomly like firelight or glowing steadily like lanterns, these illuminations moved in deliberate patterns that suggested intelligence and purpose. Margaret Hutchinson, Jeremiah's wife, independently corroborated her husband's account, while adding disturbing details that would later prove prophetic. She reported hearing sounds carried on the winter wind that resembled human voices engaged in conversation, but speaking in languages that bore no resemblance to English, French, German, or any of the native dialects she had encountered during their years in Dakota Territory. More unsettling still, she claimed that sometimes the voices spoke in perfect English, using the distinctive speech patterns and vocal characteristics of the 5 Pemberton brothers, despite occurring during hours when logic dictated they should have been asleep. The territorial sheriff, Clayton Murdoch, initially dismissed these reports as frontier superstition, exacerbated by the psychological strain of surviving Dakota winters. Sheriff Murdoch, according to his official reports housed in the North Dakota State Archives, had spent 15 years maintaining order across the vast and often lawless territory. He had investigated countless cases of disputed land claims, cattle rustling, conflicts with native tribes, and the various violence that accompanied frontier life. However, nothing in his extensive experience had prepared him for what he would discover when he finally decided to investigate the Pemberton homestead personally. The sheriff's official report, dated February 28, 1866, describes arriving at the Pemberton property on a crystalline morning when the temperature hovered 20 degrees below zero, and the snow crunched underfoot with sounds like breaking bones. The homestead appeared normal from a distance, smoke rising from the chimney, horses moving restlessly in the corral, the various outbuildings that indicated a working ranch. However, as Sheriff Murdoch approached the main house, he began noticing details that filled him with inexplicable dread. The snow around the house bore footprints, which seemed natural enough for a family of 6 men engaged in daily ranch work. However, these tracks formed patterns that defied practical explanation: perfect circles surrounding the house, figure-8 designs that intersected at mathematically precise intervals, and straight lines that led from the front door directly toward the horizon before stopping abruptly in unmarked snow. Most disturbing were the tracks that appeared to ascend into the air, as if whoever made them had simply begun walking upward into empty space. Sheriff Murdoch knocked repeatedly on the front door without receiving any response, despite clear evidence that the house remained occupied. The horses in the corral appeared healthy and well-fed, with fresh water in their troughs and hay in the feeding areas. The chickens moved normally around their coop, and fresh wood had been stacked beside the house within the previous day or two. Everything suggested a functioning homestead whose occupants had simply chosen not to answer their door. Yet something about the quality of silence emanating from the house convinced the sheriff that whatever lay beyond that wooden barrier had moved far beyond such simple explanations. When Sheriff Murdoch finally entered the house using his legal authority, he discovered a scene that challenged every assumption about the case he had formed during his ride to the property. The interior appeared completely normal, furniture arranged naturally, dishes cleaned and properly stored, beds made with military precision, and personal belongings organized exactly as one would expect in the home of 6 hard-working men. However, the occupants had vanished as completely as if they had never existed, leaving behind only questions that would haunt investigators for generations. The kitchen table held 6 plates arranged for a meal that had never been consumed, with food still warm enough to produce steam in the cold air entering through the open door. Coffee remained hot in a pot suspended over the fireplace, and bread sat freshly baked on the counter, suggesting that whoever had prepared these items had disappeared within the hour preceding the sheriff's arrival. Yet the bizarre footprint patterns outside indicated that no normal departure had occurred, while the continued presence of the horses proved that the family had not ridden away from their homestead. Most unsettling of all, Sheriff Murdoch discovered 6 identical notebooks arranged in a neat row on the mantelpiece above the fireplace. Each notebook bore the name of a different Pemberton family member, and each contained detailed records of the shared dreams that had plagued them throughout the winter months. The final entries, all dated February 27, 1866, described a dream more vivid and terrifying than any that had preceded it. A dream where the mysterious rooms finally revealed their true purpose, and the shadowy figures stepped forward to extend an invitation that could not be refused. Dr. Margaret Blackwood's investigation into the Pemberton family took an unexpected turn in the spring of 1973, when she discovered a collection of previously unknown documents in the basement archives of the Dakota Territory Historical Society. According to the curator's records, these materials had been donated anonymously in 1952 and had never been properly catalogued. Among the documents was the personal journal of Dr. Edmund Hartwell, the physician who had been called to examine the Pemberton brothers following their rescue. Dr. Hartwell's journal, written in meticulous copperplate script, contained entries spanning from March 1865 through December of the same year. The entries related to the Pemberton case were particularly detailed, revealing information that had never appeared in any official reports or newspaper accounts. According to Hartwell's notes, the 5 brothers exhibited identical physical symptoms upon their return: severe malnutrition, frostbite on their extremities, and what he described as an peculiar pallor that seemed to emanate from beneath the skin rather than simply reflecting their ordeal. More disturbing were Hartwell's observations regarding their psychological state. The doctor noted that, while the brothers claimed to remember nothing of their 3-week disappearance, they all exhibited the same involuntary physical responses to certain stimuli. When questioned about their missing time, each brother would begin trembling in an identical manner, starting with their left hand and progressing up their arm. Their pupils would dilate simultaneously, and they would all unconsciously touch their throats in the same protective gesture. Dr. Blackwood's analysis of Hartwell's medical observations led her to contact Dr. Richard Steinberg, a psychiatrist at the University of Minnesota who specialized in trauma-induced amnesia. Dr. Steinberg reviewed photocopies of Hartwell's notes and expressed particular interest in what the 1865 physician had termed synchronized behavioral patterns. According to modern understanding of trauma psychology, such identical responses among separate individuals would be extraordinarily rare, unless they had experienced the exact same traumatic event simultaneously. The investigation took another significant turn when Dr. Blackwood located the surviving members of the Pemberton family line. Through genealogical research conducted at the Minnesota Historical Society, she identified 3 living descendants: Robert Pemberton, a retired schoolteacher in Duluth; Sarah Pemberton Walsh, a librarian in Minneapolis; and James Pemberton, a farmer still living near the original family homestead. Each descendant agreed to meet with Dr. Blackwood and share family stories that had been passed down through generations. Robert Pemberton, grandson of surviving brother Thomas, revealed that his grandfather had never spoken directly about the winter of 1865. However, Thomas had left behind a collection of personal papers that included fragmentary diary entries from the 1870s and 1880s. These entries, written decades after the incident, contained cryptic references to the Watchers in the White and repeated mentions of dreams that began with the phrase, "They call us back to the clearing." According to Robert, his grandfather had suffered from severe insomnia throughout his adult life, and had developed an intense fear of winter storms. Sarah Pemberton Walsh provided even more intriguing information about her ancestor, surviving brother Michael. Family oral history maintained that Michael had become a deeply religious man following the incident, joining a strict Methodist congregation and eventually becoming a lay preacher. However, his sermons, several of which had been preserved in the church archives, contained unusual theological interpretations that seemed to blend Christian doctrine with what Sarah described as pre-Christian beliefs about winter spirits and collective dreaming. Michael's descendant explained that he had frequently preached about the importance of maintaining individual consciousness against what he termed the pull of shared sleep. The most revealing interview came from James Pemberton, whose ancestor was surviving brother Daniel. James had inherited not only the original family farm, but also a trunk containing Daniel's personal effects. Among these items was a hand-carved wooden box containing 5 identical silver pendants, each inscribed with symbols that appeared to be a mixture of Nordic runes and Native American pictographs. According to family tradition, Daniel had commissioned these pendants from a traveling metalsmith in 1866 and had worn his continuously until his death in 1923. The other 4 pendants were supposedly sent to his surviving brothers, though no documentation existed to confirm this. Dr. Blackwood arranged to have the pendants examined by Professor Carl Anderson, a specialist in pre-Columbian and Nordic symbology at the University of Chicago. Professor Anderson's analysis, completed in October 1973, revealed that the symbols represented concepts related to shared consciousness, protection from dream intrusion, and what he translated as the binding of 5 to 1. The professor noted that such symbol combinations were extremely rare and typically associated with shamanic practices, designed to prevent unwanted spiritual contact or possession. The investigation expanded further when Dr. Blackwood discovered records of similar incidents in the broader Dakota Territory region. Archives at the South Dakota State Historical Society contained references to at least 4 other cases of multiple disappearances during harsh winters between 1860 and 1890. Each case involved groups of men who vanished during blizzards and returned after extended periods with little or no memory of their experiences. The survivors in each case reportedly shared similar symptoms: synchronized physical responses, recurring dreams, and an aversion to sleeping alone during winter months. One particularly well-documented case involved the Morrison brothers, 3 men who disappeared near what is now Rapid City during the winter of 1878. According to the records maintained by the Pennington County Sheriff's Department, the Morrison brothers returned after 5 weeks with identical accounts of being sheltered in a cave by helpful strangers who had fed them and kept them warm. However, medical examination revealed that all 3 men had lost significant weight and showed signs of prolonged exposure despite their claims of being well cared for during their absence. Dr. Blackwood's research into these parallel cases led her to propose what she termed the Dakota Collective Experience Hypothesis. Based on her analysis of witness testimonies, medical records, and cultural context, she theorized that the harsh Dakota winters, combined with the psychological stress of frontier isolation, had created conditions conducive to shared psychological experiences. Her preliminary findings suggested that groups facing extreme survival situations might develop linked consciousness as an adaptive response to overwhelming environmental threats. However, Dr. Blackwood's investigation was interrupted in November 1973 when she failed to return from a research trip to the original Pemberton homestead. According to the Polk County Sheriff's Department report, Dr. Blackwood had informed her research assistant that she intended to spend 3 days examining the site where the cabin had once stood. Her rental car was found parked near the location, with all her research materials and personal belongings still inside. The keys were in the ignition, and the engine was still running when deputies arrived. The search for Dr. Blackwood involved over 50 volunteers and continued for 2 weeks despite increasingly severe weather conditions. Searchers found no trace of the professor beyond a single set of footprints leading from her car toward the approximate location of the original Pemberton cabin. The footprints continued for roughly 200 yards before ending abruptly in the middle of an open field. No signs of struggle, no blood, no torn clothing, nothing that might indicate what had happened to the experienced researcher. Dr. Blackwood's disappearance was investigated by Detective Lieutenant Frank Morrison of the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Investigation. Detective Morrison's report, filed on December 15, 1973, noted several unusual aspects of the case. The professor's footprints showed no signs of deviation or hesitation, suggesting she had walked purposefully toward an unknown destination. More puzzling was the complete absence of any other tracks in the snow, despite several witnesses reporting seeing lights and movement in the area on the night of Dr. Blackwood's disappearance. The investigation into Dr. Blackwood's disappearance revealed additional information about the original Pemberton case. Detective Morrison interviewed elderly residents of the area and discovered that local Native American communities had long considered the former Pemberton homestead to be spiritually dangerous. According to tribal elder Joseph Crow Feather, the location was known as a place where the winter spirits gather the lost ones and where dreams become stronger than the waking world. Joseph Crow Feather explained to Detective Morrison that his grandfather had known the original Pemberton family and had warned them against building their cabin in that particular location. According to tribal tradition, the area was a crossing point between the physical world and what Crow Feather translated as the realm of shared sleep. The elder explained that certain locations hold what he termed dream confluence, where individual consciousness becomes vulnerable to collective experiences that may not originate from human sources. The detective's investigation also uncovered testimony from several local residents who claimed to have experienced unusual phenomena near the former Pemberton site. Margaret Olson, whose family had farmed adjacent land since the 1890s, reported that her family had always avoided the area during winter months due to recurring experiences of shared nightmares. According to Mrs. Olson, multiple family members would occasionally wake on the same night, having dreamed identical dreams of walking through snow toward a gathering of shadowy figures. Similar accounts came from the Henderson family, the Carlsons and the Johansons, all longtime area residents whose families had settled in the region during the late 19th century. Each family reported generational experiences of shared dreams, always occurring during the harshest winter nights, always involving the same imagery of movement through snow toward an unclear destination. Several families had developed traditions of sleeping in groups during severe winter storms, believing that remaining together provided protection against what they described as the pull of the dream. Detective Morrison's investigation was officially closed as an unsolved missing person case, but the detective continued his research independently. His personal notes, discovered after his retirement in 1995, revealed that he had identified a pattern of disappearances in the area spanning over a century. According to Morrison's calculations, at least 17 people had vanished near the former Pemberton homestead between 1865 and 1973, always during severe winter weather, always leaving behind evidence of purposeful movement toward the same general location. The detective's notes also contained references to his own experiences during the investigation. Morrison reported experiencing unusually vivid dreams during the weeks he spent researching Dr. Blackwood's disappearance. These dreams, which he described in meticulous detail, involved walking through snow alongside other figures, whom he could not clearly see but somehow recognized as connected to his investigation. In his final entry, dated March 1974, Morrison wrote that he had decided to discontinue his independent research because he was beginning to experience the same synchronized physical responses that Dr. Hartwell had documented in the original Pemberton brothers. This is the story of one of the darkest chapters in criminal history in the American frontier. In 1865, in the remote wilderness of the Dakota Territory, 5 brothers shared something that defied all logical explanation. The exact same dream, night after night, until that dream became their nightmare, and ultimately led to one of the most disturbing unsolved cases in American criminal records. Before I begin, I invite you to leave a like, because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about the boundaries between the conscious and unconscious mind. The Dakota Territory in 1865 was a harsh, unforgiving landscape where survival depended on family bonds and practical wisdom. The Pemberton family had established their homestead 3 miles outside what would later become Deadwood, South Dakota. Records from the Territorial Land Office, housed in the South Dakota State Archives, show that Marcus Pemberton Sr. had claimed 160 acres of prairie land in March 1863, bringing with him his 5 adult sons, Marcus Jr., 28, Theodore, 26, Samuel, 24, Ezekiel, 22, and Benjamin, 20. According to the 1865 Dakota Territorial Census, preserved in the National Archives, the Pemberton men were considered among the most capable farmers in the region, known for their uncanny ability to work in perfect synchronization, as if they could read each other's thoughts. Local newspaper accounts from the Dakota Herald suggest this unusual coordination would prove to be both their greatest strength and their ultimate undoing. Between May 15th and May 22nd, 1865, something happened to the Pemberton brothers that would leave 3 of them dead, 1 permanently confined to the Yankton Territorial Asylum and 1 missing entirely. But according to newly discovered documents from the Territorial Medical Examiner, what the official investigation concluded was mass hysteria and fratricidal violence may have been something far more sinister and inexplicable. The incident began, according to surviving records, on the night of May 14, 1865. Dr. Cornelius Blackwood, the territorial physician who treated the surviving Pemberton brother, documented in his private journal that all 5 brothers had been experiencing identical dreams for approximately 6 weeks prior to the tragedy. The journal, discovered in 1967 during the renovation of the old Yankton Hospital building, contains detailed descriptions provided by Benjamin Pemberton, the only brother capable of coherent speech after the incident. According to Blackwood's notes, Benjamin claimed that beginning in early April 1865, all 5 brothers began experiencing the same vivid dream each night. In this dream, they found themselves standing in their wheat field at midnight, looking toward a grove of cottonwood trees that bordered their property. In the dream, a figure would emerge from the tree line, tall and impossibly thin, wearing what appeared to be a long coat that seemed to move independently of any wind. The figure would beckon to them, and despite their conscious resistance, they would find themselves walking toward it in perfect unison. Each brother described the same sensation of losing control over their own movements, as if invisible strings were pulling them forward. The dream would always end the same way. Just as they reached the edge of the grove, they would hear their father's voice calling their names, and they would awaken simultaneously, often crying out in unison, according to territorial surveyor James Morrison, who had stayed overnight at the Pemberton homestead during his mapping work in April 1865. Morrison's official surveying report, filed with the Territorial Office on April 28, 1865, contains an unusual addendum describing his experiences at the Pemberton farm. He wrote that on 3 separate nights during his stay, he was awakened by the sound of all 5 brothers shouting the same word in perfect synchronization. The word, according to Morrison's report, was "Father," spoken not in English, but in what Morrison described as an unknown tongue that seemed to bypass the ear and speak directly to the soul. Morrison noted that when he investigated these nocturnal disturbances, he found all 5 brothers standing in their shared sleeping area, their eyes open but completely unresponsive to his presence. Each brother stood in an identical posture, right arm extended toward the eastern window that faced the cottonwood grove, left hand pressed against their chest, directly over their heart. Morrison wrote that the brothers remained in this position for exactly 17 minutes each time, after which they would suddenly collapse and return to normal sleep, with no memory of the episode when questioned the following morning. The territorial records show that Morrison reported these incidents to Dr. Blackwood, who visited the Pemberton homestead on May 2, 1865, to investigate what he initially assumed was a case of shared hysteria brought on by frontier isolation. Blackwood's journal describes his growing unease as he documented the brothers' accounts. Each brother, interviewed separately, provided identical descriptions not only of the dream's content, but of minute details that should have varied between individual subconscious experiences. They described the exact number of buttons on the mysterious figure's coat, the precise pattern of shadows cast by moonlight through the cottonwood leaves, even the specific scent of earth and decay that emanated from the grove. Most disturbing to Dr. Blackwood was their unanimous description of the figure's face, or rather, the complete absence of one. According to all 5 brothers, when the figure turned toward them in the dream, there was simply a smooth expanse of pale skin where features should have been, except for 2 dark holes where eyes might have been, holes that seemed to contain not darkness, but an actively light-absorbing void. Dr. Blackwood's investigation took an ominous turn when he decided to examine the cottonwood grove that featured so prominently in the brothers' shared dream. His journal entry for May 3, 1865, describes finding a circular clearing approximately 20 feet in diameter, deep within the grove, where no grass or undergrowth would grow despite the rich soil composition. At the center of this barren circle, Blackwood discovered what he described as a depression in the earth, roughly the size and shape of a human form, as if someone had lain there for so long that their body had left a permanent impression in the ground. Soil samples that Blackwood sent to the territorial assayer in Yankton revealed an unusual mineral composition, with abnormally high levels of iron oxide and traces of organic compounds that the assayer could not identify. More troubling were Blackwood's observations about the local wildlife behavior around the grove. He noted that birds would not fly over the area, horses and cattle refused to graze within 50 yards of the tree line, and even insects seemed to avoid the space, creating an unnatural zone of silence in the otherwise vibrant prairie ecosystem. The tragic culmination of the Pemberton case began on the evening of May 15, 1865. According to Benjamin Pemberton's testimony, preserved in the territorial court records at the South Dakota State Historical Society, the shared dream that night was different from all previous occurrences. Instead of awakening when their father's voice called to them, the brothers found themselves continuing to walk into the cottonwood grove. In the dream, they reached the circular clearing that Dr. Blackwood had discovered, where the mysterious figure stood waiting beside the human-shaped depression in the earth. Benjamin's account, transcribed by territorial clerk William Ashford, describes the figure speaking to them without moving any part of what should have been its face, its voice emanating from the air around them rather than from any visible mouth. The voice, according to Benjamin, spoke in their father's tone, but used words in that same unknown language Morrison had documented. The meaning, however, was somehow instantly understood by all 5 brothers. They were to take turns lying in the earthen depression where they would join the Father who calls. Benjamin's testimony describes his growing horror as he watched his brothers comply with the figure's command, beginning with Marcus Jr., found the eldest. As each brother lay down in the depression, Benjamin reported that their physical appearance began to change, their faces becoming smooth and featureless like that of the mysterious figure. When it was Benjamin's turn, he claimed that his father's true voice, speaking in English, suddenly cut through the dream, shouting a warning that awakened him in his bed. He found himself alone in the sleeping area, with his 4 brothers nowhere to be found. A search of the homestead revealed that Marcus Jr., Theodore, Samuel, and Ezekiel had left the house sometime during the night, walking barefoot across the prairie toward the cottonwood grove. Benjamin followed their trail, clearly visible in the soft earth, and discovered a scene that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. The territorial sheriff's report, filed by Deputy Marshal Thomas Richter on May 16, 1865, documents the crime scene that Benjamin Pemberton led authorities to that morning. In the circular clearing within the cottonwood grove, investigators found Marcus Jr., Theodore, and Samuel Pemberton lying in identical positions within the earthen depression, their bodies arranged in a perfect triangle, with their heads meeting at the center. All 3 had died from what the territorial coroner determined to be simultaneous cardiac failure, despite their ages and previously excellent health. No signs of violence, poisoning, or disease could be identified. Most disturbing to the investigators was the condition of Ezekiel Pemberton, found standing at the edge of the clearing in a catatonic state, his face bearing an expression of profound terror that would never change throughout his subsequent institutionalization. Medical examination revealed that Ezekiel's vocal cords had been damaged, not by external trauma, but by what Dr. Blackwood described as excessive use, as if he had been screaming continuously for hours. The investigation into the Pemberton case was led by Territorial Marshal James Crawford, whose detailed report, archived at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, reveals the systematic approach taken by frontier law enforcement despite limited resources and expertise. Crawford's team interviewed every resident within a 20-mile radius of the Pemberton homestead, documenting a disturbing pattern of unusual experiences that coincided with the timeline of the brothers' shared dreams. Rancher Michael O'Sullivan reported that his cattle had begun gathering at the fence line closest to the Pemberton property each night, lowing in unison toward the cottonwood grove until sunrise. Schoolteacher Mary Hutchins, who lived 4 miles south of the Pemberton farm, documented in her diary that her students had begun drawing identical pictures during their daily lessons. Tall, thin figures with no faces standing among trees. When questioned, the children claimed they couldn't explain why they drew these images, describing an compulsive urge to put the figures on paper. Perhaps most significantly, Crawford's investigation uncovered evidence that the Pemberton brothers' experience was not entirely unprecedented in the region. Territorial records from the Yankton Land Office revealed that the Pemberton homestead had been established on property previously claimed by the Magnuson family in 1861. According to a brief notation in the land transfer documents, the Magnusons had abandoned their claim after what was described as circumstances detrimental to family welfare. Crawford located Henrik Magnuson in Sioux Falls, where the family had relocated after leaving their Dakota Territory homestead. Magnuson's account, recorded in Crawford's supplementary report, described experiences remarkably similar to those reported by the Pemberton brothers. Beginning in the spring of 1862, Magnuson's 3 sons had begun experiencing shared nightmares involving a faceless figure in the cottonwood grove. The dreams had continued for weeks until one night when all 3 boys disappeared from their beds. They were found the next morning in the circular clearing, alive but completely unresponsive to their parents' voices. Dr. Blackwood's examination of the Magnuson boys revealed the same vocal cord damage later found in Ezekiel Pemberton, and all 3 remained in a catatonic state until their deaths from apparent starvation 6 months later. The investigation reached a critical juncture when Marshal Crawford decided to examine the earthen depression in the cottonwood grove more thoroughly. Working with Territorial Surveyor Morrison, Crawford ordered the excavation of the site on May 20, 1865. The excavation report, preserved in the Territorial Engineering Archives, describes the discovery of human remains at a depth of approximately 4 feet below the depression's surface. The remains, examined by Dr. Blackwood and 2 additional physicians brought from Yankton, were determined to belong to an adult male of indeterminate age. The skeleton showed evidence of having been interred for decades, possibly predating European settlement in the region. Most puzzling was the condition of the skull, which showed clear signs of having been deliberately altered. The facial bones had been completely removed with surgical precision, creating the smooth, featureless appearance that matched the descriptions provided by both the Pemberton brothers and the Magnuson family. Dr. Blackwood's analysis of the remains, conducted in collaboration with Professor Harold Whitman from the newly established University of Dakota, revealed additional disturbing details. The skeleton's proportions were unusual, with arm and leg bones significantly longer than would be expected for the torso size, creating an abnormally tall and thin frame. More troubling were the findings around the burial site itself. The soil analysis showed the same unusual mineral composition found in surface samples, but at much higher concentrations. Organic residue found with the remains included traces of plant species that Professor Whitman could not identify, despite his extensive knowledge of regional flora. The burial itself appeared to have been conducted according to specific ritual requirements. With the body positioned to face east toward the rising sun, hands placed directly over the heart area, and surrounded by a careful arrangement of stones that had been carved with symbols unlike any known Native American petroglyphs in the region. The official investigation concluded on May 25, 1865, with Marshal Crawford's final report categorizing the Pemberton case as a tragedy, resulting from mass hysteria and environmental factors. The report suggested that the unusual mineral composition of the soil in the cottonwood grove, might have produced hallucinations in susceptible individuals, leading to the shared dreams and ultimately to the brothers' deaths from exposure and psychological trauma. Benjamin Pemberton was deemed mentally competent but severely traumatized, while Ezekiel was permanently committed to the territorial asylum. The Cottonwood Grove was declared off-limits to settlers, and the Pemberton property was returned to territorial control. However, Crawford's personal papers, donated to the South Dakota Historical Society by his family in 1923, reveal his private doubts about the official conclusion. In a letter to his wife dated May 30, 1865, Crawford wrote that he remained convinced that the Pemberton case involved forces beyond conventional understanding, and that the threat represented by the mysterious figure in the grove remained active and dangerous. The Pemberton case might have remained a footnote in frontier criminal history if not for the work of Dr. Margaret Thorne, a professor of psychology at the University of South Dakota, who began investigating historical cases of shared psychological phenomena in 1962. Dr. Thorne's research, funded by a grant from the National Institute of Mental Health, focused on documenting instances of collective hallucinations and mass hysteria in isolated frontier communities. Her initial interest in the Pemberton case was purely academic, but as she delved deeper into the territorial archives, Dr. Thorne uncovered evidence suggesting that the mysterious deaths in the Dakota Territory Cottonwood Grove were part of a larger pattern spanning decades and multiple locations. Dr. Thorne's breakthrough came when she discovered a collection of papers in the basement of the old territorial courthouse in Yankton, documents that had been misfiled and forgotten for nearly a century. Among these papers was a correspondence file between Dr. Blackwood and physicians in Minnesota, Iowa, and Nebraska territories, discussing similar cases of shared dreams and unexplained deaths in isolated farming communities. The pattern was remarkably consistent. Families with multiple adult children living in proximity to areas of old-growth trees would begin experiencing identical dreams featuring a tall, faceless figure. The dreams would continue for weeks or months until culminating in the disappearance or death of some or all family members, always found in circular clearings where no vegetation would grow. Dr. Thorne's investigation revealed at least 12 documented cases between 1858 and 1867 across the frontier territories, all sharing the same basic characteristics. In each case, excavation of the affected sites revealed the remains of individuals buried decades or centuries earlier, with the same surgical removal of facial bones and abnormal skeletal proportions. Dr. Thorne's correspondence with the Smithsonian Institution, preserved in her research files at the University of South Dakota, indicates that she believed these remains represented evidence of a previously unknown cultural practice among pre-Columbian inhabitants of the Great Plains region. The most significant discovery in Dr. Thorne's research was her identification of the mysterious language spoken by the faceless figure in the shared dreams. Working with linguist Professor David Chen from the University of Chicago, Dr. Thorne analyzed the phonetic descriptions provided by survivors from multiple cases. Professor Chen's analysis, published in the Journal of American Linguistics in 1965, identified the language as a dialect of Proto-Siouan, with significant variations that suggested extreme antiquity. The translations provided by Chen revealed that the mysterious figure's communications were religious or ceremonial in nature, involving concepts of spiritual succession and the continuation of ancient guardianship roles. Dr. Thorne's research took a dramatic turn in the summer of 1966 when she decided to visit the original Pemberton homestead site, now part of the Black Hills National Forest. Her field notes, discovered after her disappearance, describe finding the Cottonwood Grove exactly as described in the 1865 investigation reports. The circular clearing remained completely barren of vegetation, and the earthen depression was still clearly visible, despite a century of weather exposure. Dr. Thorne's photographs, developed from film found in her abandoned campsite, show the grove in daylight. But several images contain unexplained anomalies: tall, thin shadows that don't correspond to any visible trees, and what appears to be a human figure in the background of shots that Dr. Thorne's field notes indicate were taken of an empty clearing. Dr. Thorne disappeared on August 15, 1966, after spending 3 days camping near the former Pemberton property. Her research assistant, graduate student Michael Harrison, found her campsite abandoned with all equipment intact and no signs of struggle or departure. Harrison's report to the Forest Service, archived at the Black Hills National Forest headquarters, describes finding Dr. Thorne's final research notes laid out on her camp table as if she had been interrupted while writing. The final entry, dated August 14th, describes her experience of hearing voices calling her name from the direction of the cottonwood grove throughout the previous night. Dr. Thorne wrote that the voices sounded like her deceased father, speaking in the same unknown language documented in the historical cases she had been investigating. The search for Dr. Thorne involved federal and state law enforcement agencies, but no trace of her was ever found. However, her disappearance prompted a more comprehensive investigation led by FBI agent Robert Hayes, whose classified report, declassified under the Freedom of Information Act in 1995, reveals disturbing parallels between Dr. Thorne's case and the historical incidents she had been studying. Agent Hayes's investigation uncovered evidence that Dr. Thorne had been experiencing shared dreams with other researchers who had investigated similar historical cases. Dr. Patricia Wells from the University of Minnesota and Professor James Morrison from Iowa State University both reported identical dreams featuring a faceless figure in a grove of trees, dreams that had begun shortly after they initiated their own research into frontier-era unexplained deaths. Agent Hayes's report documents his interview with Benjamin Pemberton, Jr., grandson of the sole surviving Pemberton brother, who had continued to live in the Deadwood area. Benjamin Jr.'s testimony, given in 1967, revealed that his grandfather had continued to experience the shared dreams throughout his life, despite being the only surviving member of his original family. According to Benjamin Jr., his grandfather claimed that the faceless figure in the dreams had continued to call to him nightly, but that his father's warning voice had also continued to protect him from answering that call. Benjamin Jr. reported that his grandfather had passed down specific instructions for avoiding the influence of what he called the father who is not father, including never sleeping alone near old-growth trees and always carrying a piece of iron blessed by running water. Modern investigations into the Pemberton case have been complicated by changes in land use and development, but evidence suggests that the phenomenon described in historical documents continues to occur in the region. Forest Service records from the Black Hills National Forest, obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, document at least 15 incidents since 1970 involving hikers or campers who disappeared near areas matching the description of the original Cottonwood Grove. In each case, search teams found evidence of the missing individuals having walked deliberately into wooded areas, often leaving behind personal belongings arranged in careful patterns that match descriptions from the historical cases. The most recent documented incident occurred in October 2019 when a family camping group reported that all 4 of their teenage children had experienced identical dreams on consecutive nights while camping in the Black Hills. Park rangers interviewed by local media described the teens as traumatized, but unable to provide detailed accounts of their experiences, speaking only of a tall figure without a face who had called to them using their grandfather's voice. The family's campsite was found abandoned on the morning of October 15th, with the teenagers discovered hours later standing in a line at the edge of a grove of old cottonwood trees, unresponsive but physically unharmed. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a psychologist from Rapid City who treated the teenagers after their 2019 experience, has documented the case as part of her ongoing research into collective trauma responses. Her preliminary findings, published in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology, suggest that the teenagers continue to experience shared dreams 6 months after their initial incident, dreams that exactly match the historical descriptions from the Pemberton case. Dr. Walsh's interviews reveal that the teens report hearing their grandfather's voice calling to them in a language they don't recognize but somehow understand, urging them to return to the grove and take their place with the father who waits. The evidence compiled over more than 150 years of documentation suggests that the Pemberton case represents not an isolated historical tragedy, but an ongoing phenomenon that continues to affect individuals who encounter specific geographical locations in the Black Hills region. The consistency of reported experiences across multiple generations and cultural backgrounds indicates that whatever force was responsible for the deaths of Marcus Jr., Theodore, and Samuel Pemberton in 1865 remains active and continues to seek new victims through the same methods of shared dreams and psychological manipulation. 5 brothers entered that cottonwood grove in their dreams in 1865. Only one walked away with his sanity intact. The others joined something that has been calling to vulnerable minds for centuries, using the voices of deceased family members to lure new victims into its ancient circle. If you ever find yourself camping or hiking in the Black Hills, and you begin to dream of a tall figure without a face calling to you in your father's voice, remember the warning passed down through the Pemberton family. Iron blessed by running water, never sleep alone near old trees, and if the father who calls doesn't sound quite right, don't answer, because some invitations are meant to be refused forever.